Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we're unpacking a heavyweight panel discussion about something that's honestly deeply unsettling.
Oh yeah, it's a massive topic.
It really is. We're looking at the survival of Western Enlightenment values, and specifically this intense philosophical battle between a secular atheistic worldview and the rising tide of fundamentalist belief in God.
Right.
Because there's this profound tension, you know?
Ah.
How does a rational secular world where your ultimate life goal might literally just be buying the latest smartphone and figuring out what to stream on Netflix tonight, how does that compete with the intoxicating absolute meaning offered by theocratic religion?
It's a heavy question.
Yeah. Are we losing the battle of ideas simply because atheism completely struggles to offer the profound sense of divine purpose that fundamentalist faith just effortlessly provides? We're going to dive deep into all of that today. And hey, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep bringing you these deep dives.
So just to set the stage here, and I want to put a clear disclaimer out right at the start.
Yeah.
The sources we're dissecting today come from a deeply layered panel discussion featuring voices like Maajid Nawaz, Sam Harris, Douglas Murray, Bret Weinstein, and Eric Weinstein.
Yeah, some very prominent voices.
Exactly. And because they delve into some incredibly politically charged topics, foreign policy, Islamic extremism, the failures of both left-wing and right-wing ideologies, we need to make it clear that we are not taking sides or endorsing any of these specific viewpoints.
Right. Our mission is just to impartially analyze the ideas they're bringing to the table.
Precisely. We're just the neutral lens helping you, the listener, dissect what this panel is actually saying about this crisis of meaning in the West.
So to start stripping this down, the panel begins by doing something called steel manning.
Yeah, which is the opposite of straw manning.
Right. So instead of building a weak version of your opponent's argument just to knock it down easily, you build the strongest possible version of their attack so you can truly understand it.
And the person they asked to do this is Maajid Nawaz, which is fascinating because he actually spent a large portion of his early life deeply entrenched in radical Islamist ideology before he abandoned it.
So he knows the rhetoric inside and out.
Oh, absolutely. He articulates the most robust critique of Western secular democracies from that Islamist perspective. And the core charge he builds is just one of staggering, lethal hypocrisy.
But how does he frame that hypocrisy? Because, I mean, it's pretty easy to call any government hypocritical. What are the specific pressure points he uses to build this steel man?
Well, he focuses heavily on foreign policy. The argument is that the West loudly champions liberal, secular, democratic values, right?
Sure.
But the minute economic or geopolitical interests are threatened, those values just evaporate. He points to places like Saudi Arabia.
All right.
You have an absolute monarchy there. Basic human rights are practically non-existent by Western standards. Yet they enjoy massive economic and military support from Western democracies.
Because of the oil and capital flow. So the critique is that the West's morality is entirely conditional.
Exactly. But it's not just passive alliances. That's the darker half of the foreign policy steelman. Nawaz points out how the West has proactively undermined governments, even democratically elected ones, if they didn't align with Western interests.
Like the Cold War era stuff?
Yeah, assassinations of foreign leaders, the Iran-Contra affair. But the glaring modern example used in the panel is the invasion of Iraq.
Right. Bush and Blair claiming to spread freedom and democracy.
But doing it via violent military occupation. Nawaz argues that completely shatter the credibility of those concepts in the region. He makes a very pointed observation that al-Qaeda wasn't even in Iraq before the invasion.
And ISIS certainly didn't exist there.
Right. So the opponent's view becomes clear. Your Enlightenment values are just a marketing campaign for brute imperialism.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the hypocrisy charge doesn't just stop at foreign borders, right? If we're looking at the strongest possible argument against the West, how does the steel man address domestic policy? Does the panel argue that these Enlightenment values are eroding at home, too?
Absolutely, they do. The Islamist argument dictates that when Western power is threatened, the very first things thrown out the window are these supposedly sacred civil liberties.
Interesting.
Nawaz lists several striking examples from his time in the UK. He mentions the political push for a 48-day detention without trial for terror suspects.
Wow.
And he brings up the UK Terrorism Act of 2000, specifically Schedule 7.
Wait, Schedule 7? Isn't that the provision regarding ports and airports? How does the panel frame that as a collapse of Enlightenment values?
Because it effectively removes the right to silence under interrogation at any port of entry or exit in the UK.
You literally have to answer.
It makes it a criminal offense not to answer police questions.
Yeah.
So when you consider how foundational the right against self-incrimination is to a liberal democracy, stripping that away based purely on geography and suspicion is a massive concession.
That's a huge point.
And the source goes even deeper into the shadows, detailing the UK's involvement in rendition.
Sending suspects to third-party countries known for using torture to extract information?
Precisely. The UK benefited from intelligence gathered by regimes that practiced torture. They even had to pay out massive financial settlements to jihadist sympathizers like Mohsen Beg due to complicity in his interrogation and torture in Bagram.
Right, in Afghanistan.
So the Steel Man basically says to the secular West, you criticize theocratic societies for being barbaric, but your open society is an illusion. It relies on black sites and suspending rights the second you feel scared.
That is a brutally effective structural critique. But Nawaz also brings a deeply emotional element to this argument, right? He references a section from his autobiography called The Polemic.
Yes.
And it touches on a very specific historical interview. What is the psychological mechanism he's highlighting there?
He's highlighting how Western geopolitical collateral damage is weaponized to recruit for a holy war. He references a notorious 60 Minutes interview from 1996 with former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright.
I remember this being brought up.
The interviewer, Leslie Stahl, asked Albright about the crushing economic sanctions on Iraq after the Gulf War. Stahl noted that 500,000 Iraqi children had died. She explicitly stated that this was more children than died at Hiroshima.
God.
And she asked Albright, is the price worth it?
That is a staggering human toll. What was the administration's public response to that?
Albright's response, which Nawaz quotes as being permanently etched into the minds of anti-Western recruiters, was, I think it is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Just writing off 500,000 children, you can completely see how that one sentence is weaponized.
Oh, without a doubt.
If a secular democracy can justify the deaths of 500,000 innocent kids as a hard choice for its foreign policy, then an extremist recruiter can easily tell a young man that shrouding their own violence in divine justice is entirely justified.
What's fascinating here is how this transitions the panel's conversation away from just geopolitics and directly into the core philosophical crisis of our time.
The friction between an atheistic worldview and the overwhelming power of God belief.
Yes. Sam Harris takes this thread and argues that defending reason and the scientific method against a creeping theocracy is incredibly difficult because living an unambiguously profound secular life is genuinely hard.
This gets to the absolute heart of the deep dive. Harris is essentially pointing out a massive void in the secular worldview.
A huge void.
He contrasts the modern secular life, which often just boils down to participating in free markets, buying the next iteration of a smartphone, and endlessly scrolling Netflix. He contrasts that with what fundamentalist religion offers.
He calls it the whole package. Militant Islam, for instance, isn't just a set of rules. It's an all-encompassing identity.
Right.
It offers rapid indoctrination, a built-in community of brothers, and crucially, especially for young men brimming with testosterone, it offers a literal James Bondian adventure.
You're not just a guy working a desk job.
Exactly. You aren't just a cog in a corporate machine. You are a holy warrior fighting for the creator of the universe. It offers off-the-shelf, absolute meaning.
And atheism just doesn't have a counteroffer that visceral. Harris points out that secular societies are struggling to connect people with purpose without relying on what he calls bullshit.
Meaning without ancient myths.
Right, without asking them to believe in ancient myths or lying to them about the nature of reality. But because the secular shelf in the bookstore of meaning is currently sitting totally empty, these ancient absolutist worldviews are rushing in to fill the void.
And this lack of profound shared meaning leads to what Douglas Murray describes as a catastrophic loss of spine in the West.
A loss of spine.
Yeah, he warns that Western intellectuals have become so intensely secularized that they've completely lost their ability to even comprehend religious fervor. We literally forget how to talk about God or how to understand people who truly believe they are operating under a divine mandate.
Murray shares a striking anecdote about a TV producer to illustrate this exact blind spot.
Yes, it's a perfect example. He talks about interacting with a major network TV producer during the absolute height of ISIS's power in the Middle East. The producer genuinely asked him, what do ISIS actually want?
And what did he say?
Murray explained that ISIS was completely open about their theology. They literally wanted to bring about the end times. They wanted to trigger the apocalypse as prophesied in their specific interpretation of Scripture.
And how did the secular TV producer process that?
She couldn't compute it at all. Her reaction was essentially that such a goal was ridiculous. She assumed their aims had to be mundane, pragmatic, and political.
Wow.
Murray jokes that if he had told her ISIS was fighting for a 2.5% reduction in VAT, she would have understood it perfectly.
She probably would have suggested they'd settle for 1.2%.
Exactly.
That perfectly illustrates the danger of projection. When a secular society projects its own lack of religious zeal onto its adversaries, it wildly underestimates the threat.
It's extremely dangerous.
If you think your opponent is fighting over a border dispute or tax policy, you try to negotiate. But you cannot negotiate with an adversary who genuinely believes they have the divine explanation for the end of time.
No, you can't.
Especially when their ultimate reward requires your destruction.
Which brings us to another massive threat the panel identifies. It's not just a battle between secular Western democracies and foreign theocracies. Bret Weinstein shifts the focus to the fact that Enlightenment values are under severe attack from the inside.
From the academic left.
Yes.
This is a completely different front in the same war on objective reality. How does the academic left fit into a discussion about fundamentalist religion?
Bret Weinstein notes that within certain academic circles, it has become fashionable and sophisticated to argue against the very mechanisms of the Enlightenment. They attack the scientific method, logic, and objective truth itself.
Because they view it as a power structure.
Right. Because the Enlightenment was largely a European phenomenon by historical accident, postmodernists argue that the tools of the Enlightenment are inherently Eurocentric. They claim they are just rigged power structures designed to preserve white Western dominance.
The panel mentions a specific example of this mindset. A speaker on a college campus literally described the concept of facts as European-centric.
It's incredible.
The idea that a verifiable fact is something to be fought against simply because of the philosophical framework it originates from. But what really stands out in the sources is the bizarre political alliance that forms out of this postmodern worldview.
It's a massive contradiction that Eric Weinstein points out. You have the postmodern left, which outwardly claims to champion extreme egalitarianism, LGBTQ rights, and feminism somehow ending up rationalizing, defending, or at least running interference for extremely intolerant, fundamentalist religious ideologies.
Ideologies that, as Nawaz points out in the source, overwhelmingly pull in favor of criminalizing homosexuality and subjugating women.
Right.
Why does that alliance happen, though? How do two completely opposed value systems end up on the same side of the cultural divide?
Because they share a common enemy, the traditional Western power structure. The postmodernist wants to deconstruct the West because they view it as an oppressive patriarchy, and the fundamentalist wants to destroy the West because they view it as godless and decadent.
So the postmodern left becomes so obsessed with tearing down the Enlightenment that they just ignore the horrifying reality of what would actually replace it?
Yes. It speaks to a deep moral frivolity.
That moral frivolity is perfectly captured in the anecdote the panel shares about a clickbait TV interview in the UK. The broadcaster, Piers Morgan, was debating a guest, and during the argument, the guest proudly declared, "I'm literally a communist, you idiot."
And the terrifying part wasn't just that she said it. The source highlights that rather than this being seen as an extreme or deeply problematic statement, given the staggering death tolls and gulags associated with 20th century communism, the clip went viral in a positive way.
People praised it.
Yeah, prominent magazine. The panel couldn't recall if it was Teen Vogue or Elle, ran an article essentially calling her a hero for shutting up Piers Morgan with that line.
To proudly embrace an ideology responsible for tens of millions of deaths just to score a fleeting point in a modern culture war proves the panel's point.
It really does.
For the postmodernists, words and ideologies have lost all connection to historical reality and human suffering. It's all just rhetoric and power games.
But Eric Weinstein introduces a concept to try and explain why so many people, particularly the youth, are so angry at the Western system that they'd flirt with communism or postmodernism in the first place. He introduces the concept of Enlightenment Plus.
Enlightenment Plus.
He says, look, you have the Enlightenment, which contains all the beautiful, noble software like all men are created equal, the scientific method, and one person, one vote. But then you have the plus.
The plus being the incredibly dark, dirty tricks of statecraft used to maintain Western hegemony.
Exactly. The source lists specific, undeniable historical examples. The Dulles brothers and Kermit Roosevelt, actively destabilizing Iran.
Right.
The FBI's COINTEL program in America, which involved assassinating Black Panther leader Fred Hampton in his bed, and intentionally driving the actress Jean Seberg to suicide for supporting radical black rights.
So the plus is the theft of resources, the lying to the public, the sheer hypocrisy.
Eric Weinstein argues that when a society constantly extols its noble egalitarian virtues while simultaneously committing these dark imperial acts, citizens eventually find out, and they get incredibly cynical and embittered.
And that anger is entirely justified. The question is, what do we do with that anger? The postmodern impulse is to say the system is entirely corrupt, throw the whole thing away. How does Brett Weinstein counter that impulse?
He offers a brilliant, pragmatic counter-perspective. He speaks as someone of Jewish descent, acknowledging that the Enlightenment was not a Jewish phenomenon, it was European. But, he says, he is still going to wield the tools of the Enlightenment reason, logic, the scientific method, like a broadsword.
Like a broadsword. Why?
Because regardless of who invented them or what terrible things those inventors did, they are simply the best tools available for understanding how the universe actually functions.
So he argues that just because the power derived from Enlightenment values isn't evenly distributed across the globe, you don't reject the toolkit to level the playing field.
No, you don't throw away the concept of a fair trial or objective truth just because the architects of those concepts were hypocrites.
The goal shouldn't be to destroy the broadsword. The goal must be to democratize it. You bring everybody on board with the toolkit so that everyone has access to the most powerful methods for discovering the truth.
Eric Weinstein adds that we need to start dealing in adult-level fictions. We need the maturity to admit that a state is occasionally going to do terrible things to survive in a hostile world, but that the Enlightenment system, while deeply flawed and riddled with the plus, still works exponentially better than any proposed alternative.
Right. When Douglas Murray asks the critics, compared to what? The silence is deafening. Every alternative proposed, whether it's radical theocracy or postmodern deconstruction, promises radically worse outcomes, far more suffering, and the death of free inquiry.
That's true.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because all of these high-level philosophical arguments, atheism versus God, Enlightenment versus postmodernism, they aren't just academic debates.
No, they're not.
They have visceral physical consequences in the real world. Sam Harris closes out this section of the panel with a story that brings all of this crashing down to reality.
It is a truly tragic story that perfectly encapsulates the fatal blind spot of modern secularism. Harris recounts reading a report from New York Times journalist Rukmini Callimachi.
Yeah.
She reported on a young, deeply idealistic American couple who had decided to ride their bicycles around the world. At one point, their journey took them through the landscape of Tajikistan.
And Harris describes this couple as the ultimate embodiment of youthful, secular Enlightenment idealism.
They really were.
They were riding across the globe, consciously projecting the philosophy that we live in one borderless world. They documented their travels on a blog, operating under the fundamental belief that the world is inherently safe and that people everywhere, regardless of culture, race, or religion, are fundamentally well-intentioned.
They believe that evil is mostly just a misunderstanding. And if you just put yourself out there openly, humanity will embrace you.
And the heartbreak of the story is that for a long time, their hypothesis seemed correct. They found kind, welcoming people for most of their journey. They were hosted and fed by strangers.
Right up until the moment they encountered a man who had consciously pledged affiliation to ISIS. This man saw this couple riding their bicycles, recognized them clearly as Western foreigners, and intentionally ran them over with a vehicle as an act of jihad.
He didn't know them.
He didn't care about their secular idealism. He saw running over an infidel as his explicit religious duty to God.
So, what does this all mean? Why does Harris choose to end on this devastating story? It's because it exposes the catastrophic vulnerability of secular idealism when it is entirely blind to the realities of fundamentalist bad ideas.
It's a perfect, tragic collision.
Youthful idealism believing the world is inherently safe and tolerant, literally pedaling blindly into the path of an ideology rooted in theocratic absolutism. It proves that bad ideas that offer absolute militant meaning derived from ancient texts are sometimes indistinguishable from the worst human evil.
And no amount of secular optimism or open-mindedness can simply wish those ideas away.
It's a stark, undeniable warning. The panel is ultimately arguing that a secular society cannot survive purely on naivety, the consumption of goods, and a refusal to look malevolence in the eye.
Absolutely.
To bring all these complex threads together for you, defending a secular, well-informed, and rational society is infinitely harder than just pointing out facts or throwing a science textbook at a theocrat.
It takes so much more than that.
The panel argues that we have to be brutally honest and acknowledge Western hypocrisy, the dark reality of enlightenment, plus, so it can't be so easily weaponized by recruiters. We have to fundamentally understand the immense, intoxicating, mobilizing power of God and religion, rather than just dismissing believers as uneducated or ridiculous.
Right.
And we must fiercely, unapologetically defend the scientific method and objective truth against both foreign theocracies that demand absolute submission and domestic postmodernists who want to deconstruct the very concept of reality.
Which leaves us with a deeply provocative thought to ponder on your own.
Yeah.
If the secular atheistic world fundamentally struggled to provide the deep, mobilizing meaning that fundamentalist religion offers so effortlessly, and if we remain steadfast in our refusal to rely on the comforting, supernatural myths of ancient texts, what entirely new narratives, philosophies, or community structures could we possibly build?
That is a million-dollar question.
How do we fill that massive, aching void in the human psyche with reality-based profundity before more extreme, absolutist ideologies fill it for us?
That is a massive question to sit with. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the sources, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.